Welcome to Handshaw's Horizon Podcast, where we explore learning science and all the amazing tools to help us design and deliver amazing learning experiences that are effective and meaningful. Our current focus is on creating the culture or the environment where learners perform at a higher level, even a higher level than they thought they could, but a higher level compared to other environments. So what makes a high performance classroom or a high performing classroom? It's all about the culture that's created, and you as the instructor are 100% responsible for creating that environment. And as a designer, you are also responsible for helping the instructor create that environment. And we do this through the creation of Instructor Presence. So what is Instructor Presence? Well, Niche et al. 2019, they looked at Instructor Presence as a part of a meta-analysis of why teaching online is different. And they came up with there is a cognitive presence, social presence, and a teaching presence. The cognitive presence is really your experience and expertise in the content area. Then you have your social presence, which is how you share a little bit of who you are. We always have to keep that balance, right? Share a little bit of who you are, be vulnerable, so maybe share some of your failures in life. And that helps create that, if you listen to last podcast, the rewarded vulnerability or being vulnerable, because if you want your students to be vulnerable and take chances, guess what? You have to be vulnerable and take chances. And then teaching presence, which is really the managerial stuff within the classroom or the LMS, whatever that may be. So as you can see, there are a lot of areas where the instructor is in control of this, but also as designers, we can facilitate that instructor presence as well. So we're going to dive into a little bit of both of those. And as we do that, one of the biggest influences that an instructor can have on a student, and this comes from Hattie and his work on visual learning, is how I feel a student can perform. That has, I wanted to say, 1.33 effect size on a student's performance. So if I believe a student can perform well, they're more likely to perform well. If I don't think they're going to be able to perform well, they're not going to be able to perform well unless they have a huge amount of self-efficacy. Well, that also translates into the business world. So if I think somebody on my team is not going to perform well, guess what? They're not. Now, why does this happen? Well, that is a part of instructor presence. Because if we have a feeling that this student or this team member is not able to perform, guess what we do? We spend less time in the detail of an explanation. The way we communicate is slightly different as well. So that affects their ability because they get that message. Learners get that message loud and clear, just like a team member gets that message loud and clear. How we approach, how we do everything within the classroom matters. So what does this look like as an instructor with cognitive presence? Well, cognitive presence permeates everything that we do. Let's first discuss about giving feedback. We already know about giving feedback from the 10,000 hour rule and deliberate practice, the best ways to give feedback. Now, if we're going to create our cognitive presence, it ties into that as well, because one way where we give amazing feedback is to give contextual feedback. So we don't always want to just focus on the mechanics of whatever the project is or the paper is. We want to focus on the context and give some contextual feedback. And this could come in the form of a project where you can see, I see you approached the project from this perspective, and you have it well thought out. There's also this other way that you could have come at this too and had possibly either just as positive outcomes or even better outcomes. So it's always good to think from two perspectives. So we're not deducting points for that contextual input, but we are giving our expertise. That's one way to build cognitive presence. Another way to build cognitive presence as a instructor, tell stories. Tell a story of, whatever in the field when you were doing X, Y, or Z. tell those stories. One thing that I just love to do as an instructor is I tell a story that helps build my social presence, believe it or not, of when I went through graduate school and I had adopted 3 children at the age of 1, and newborn. My wife and I adopted 3 children. And I was in graduate school, and I tell the story of what I learned from doing that and how I learned to really prioritize things in my life and come to the conclusion that a B in this class is good enough. Not going to do that extra effort that's going to require me to take away from this. And that was just kind of a fun experience that I shared, and that helped people understand who I was, and that story helped to build my social presence. And what is our social presence? Well, that's where we build that space where learners are comfortable talking to us, coming to us with issues, many different things like that. And it's where we can share our mistakes. So learners can say, oh, okay, well, George did this, Dr. George made this mistake, did that, and he recovered, and here he is now, he's where I want to be. So that just being real builds that social presence. And then our teaching presence is the managerial stuff, grading papers and projects on time, making sure that the LMS or the course content is structured in a way that is logical, things like that. So we have a big impact on all of that. So as an instructor, we can build cognitive presence. That's sharing our expertise. We do that in many different ways. I love to tell stories of a time when I had a huge failure, but it turned out to be a success as well when I was pitching an idea of creating a class on building the plastics training course. So not plastics, but composite trainings course for a new jet that we were building, the F-35, and how the initial outcome was very bad. And then we were able to change it around to make it something not just positive, but use it as a relationship builder with all of the other departments that were engaged with the process of building these parts. So it was a very positive outcome, and it showed how, okay, if you have a failure, that's not permanent. You need to use that to build a relationship and let people know that you're listening. So that is always a fun story that I like to tell within my instructional design classes as well. And then the social present, we chatted about that one, just let people in a little bit. And then the teaching presence is just keep all the managerial tasks in order. Now, the next piece of this is how do we do that as an instructional designer? So how do we influence the instructor presence as an instructional designer? Well, there's many ways that we can do that. The first one, the easiest one, is the teaching presence. So what is teaching presence? That is that the managerial task. Is this course set up in a logical fashion? When I look at it, does it look good? Is it clean? Is it crisp? Does it meet my expectations? Is it easy to navigate? All sorts of those things help create instructor presence. So that's how the instructional designer can create that instructor presence. For cognitive presence, we can do all kinds of things to help the instructor share their experience. We can even create quizzes where the instructor either does audio or video feedback after every question. And I'm not talking about a graded quiz. I'm just talking about a quiz that helps with the learning process. Ask a question maybe in the beginning of the class so learners may or may not know the response, but then they get that response from the instructor saying, okay, you answered this, which I can see how you did that, but take a look from this perspective. So now the instructor is giving that contextual expertise back to the learner, and that's one way that we can help them create that cognitive instructor presence. And then social presence is just creating a space for them to be able to share stories. That can be within the LMS, within the classroom, wherever it may be. So just helping guide how the course is created and put in specific points where they can share stories about themselves, the failures, or like me when I thought it was a good idea to go through grad school after adopting a 1 and newborn. Things like that just make the instructor more approachable, and that then shapes the environment. So now remember, we have 2 things to create a high performing environment, either for students or for business teams, and that is psychological safety and high standards. So by sharing all of these things to build that instructor presence up, we are creating that culture of being exceptional. We are building that culture of continually improving and continually getting better, because you're showing that you've done that through instructor presence. The instructional designer is helping you show that through your instructor presence as well, because remember, culture eats content for lunch. If you have the greatest culture or the greatest content in the world, but you haven't created the culture where it's easy for that student to really digest that and put it to work, it's not going to stick. So that's why culture eats content for lunch, because when we create the right culture, they're going to take that content, they're going to use it in new ways to creatively solve complex problems. So that is instructor presence in a nutshell, and we want to create a very positive instructor presence through cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence. And both the instructor is 100% in charge of that, and the instructional designer has a very high level of influence with that. So until next time, remember that culture eats content for lunch.